Now let's look at the last component of ecosystems, the nutrients. In this mini lecture, we'll cover the nutrient cycles of nitrogen and phosphorus as well as carbon. Related to carbon cycles, we'll also address the issue of climate change. Here are your learning objectives. You saw this slide in the last mini lecture. We covered light and water. Now we'll look at these nutrients. Nitrogen is our first nutrient. It's incredibly important in life forms because it's required to build proteins. Think back to our very first mini lecture. Protein was one of the 4 key words we addressed as requirements to define life. Proteins are used in metabolism, which is used to create energy, which is used to maintain homeostasis. Proteins are a big deal, so nitrogen is a big deal. The great thing is that the Earth's atmosphere is mostly nitrogen. There's plenty of it. However, the form nitrogen takes in the atmosphere is not usable by most life forms. That type of nitrogen has to be modified by a specific group of bacteria called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These bacteria often have a symbiotic relationship with certain plants, the legumes, plants like peas and beans. If you've ever heard of a victory garden, they're these home gardens promoted during the World Wars. Advice was to plant peas or beans early in the year. Then when they grew to a certain height, you plow them into the soil. Then you can plant the crops you actually want to grow. The reason for this was that the legumes and their symbiotic bacteria would fix nitrogen into that plant. When those plants are plowed into the soil, they would slightly decompose and release their usable nitrogen into the soil so that your other crops could use that. It's fertilizer for your other crops. During times of war, fertilizers are in short supply because fertilizer manufacturing is also used in making bombs. The nitrogen-fixing capabilities of legumes is also the reason why these are such a high-protein food. Peanuts, soybeans or tofu, and chickpeas are all examples. Let's take a look at the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is found in the atmosphere in an unusable form for most of life. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria modify the nitrogen into a usable form. These bacteria have a symbiotic relationship with plants and supply usable nitrogen directly to them. Animals eat the protein from the plants and get their nitrogen that way. If the plant dies and decomposes, or the animal dies or defecates and decomposes, the decomposing organisms in the soil break that material down. Nitrogen can then be taken up by another plant and the cycle starts over again. Or other decomposers can further break down nitrogen, releasing it back into the air in its unusable form. Nitrogen, by the way, is used in fertilizers and is usually the highest percentage. Fertilizers have on their packaging these NPK numbers. The numbers correspond with nitrogen, N, phosphorus, P, and potassium, K. The next nutrient we'll look at is phosphorus. Phosphorus is found in rocks that usually erode slowly due to rainfall. That small amount of phosphorus is taken up by plant roots, or if the phosphorus makes its way into a pond or stream, algae will absorb it. The plants are eaten by animals, as are algae, and when plants, animals, or wastes decompose, the phosphorus can be taken up by other life forms. But sometimes phosphorus, especially in algae, gets buried in the sediment at the bottom of that body of water. In that case, the algae doesn't decompose but gets encased in layers of sediment. Over millions of years, that sediment compresses and forms new rock. If geologic processes raise that rock up to the surface, it will again begin to erode and release its phosphorus. Phosphorus is picked up very quickly by life forms, like in a matter of seconds, because it's so valuable and so rare. Phosphorus is used in cellular energy. You might have heard of ATP. Those P's are all phosphoruses. It's also used in the sugar backbones of DNA, and it's used in cell membranes, the phospholipid bilayers. So it's a very important nutrient in life forms. Phosphorus is also the source of many environmental problems. Naturally occurring phosphorus is very rare in the environment, so dispersing large amounts of phosphorus can have a huge impact on an ecosystem. We mine for phosphorus to use in industrial fertilizers, rather than waiting for it to erode naturally from rocks, of course. Mining can have spills, and a phosphorus spill can be catastrophic. But even more common, phosphorus is added into the environment through fertilizers. If there's too much fertilizer applied, it's in the wrong place or at the wrong time, it can run off into the water supply where algae absorb it at a ridiculously fast rate and use it to reproduce. This causes massive algae blooms, which cause fish die-offs for two reasons. The first reason is that when algae populations get too dense, they release toxins. Some forms of algae that do this are called red tides. The second reason is that algae don't have long lifespans. If a lot of them reproduce and grow, there's a lot that will die. When they die, they decompose, which uses up all the oxygen in the water. This creates what we call a dead zone. Another source of phosphorus is in detergents. So if you go to a grocery store, look for the detergents with phosphate-free on the label. They're pretty easy to find these days. The third nutrient we'll cover today is carbon. Carbon's also found in the atmosphere with nitrogen. It moves into plants by the process of photosynthesis. Let's look at a very simplified version of that equation. We have a plant. It takes in carbon dioxide and water. If you have a plant, you know you have to water it, and you know it takes in carbon dioxide and gives off oxygen. So on this side, we're going to have some oxygen. Sunlight provides energy for this reaction to occur. We're going to simplify this idea and just say that these atoms, the carbons, oxygens, and hydrogens from carbon dioxide and water, they break apart and reassociate into sugar molecules and oxygen molecules. The most common sugar is sucrose. It's C6H12O6. So these atoms are just rearranged from the left side of the equation to the right side. But this sugar is a much more complex molecule. So it needs a lot more energy to build that. That energy came from the sun. The other product is oxygen. Most of the oxygen is released from the plants. These sugars are used to build up structures in the plant. For instance, cellulose is just made of sugar, backed on sugar, and packed together in this complex cellulose molecule that's very stable and very strong. Alternatively, sugars can also be used the same way we animals use sugars. They can be broken down, all that energy stored can be released to power metabolism. That happens by running this equation backwards. So we have CO2 plus H2O. We've got some energy added in. We have sugar plus oxygen. That's photosynthesis. If we run the equation backwards, we get energy out. This is respiration, cellular respiration. So when we animals need energy for our bodies, we take in food, sugar, we breathe in oxygen, we run this backwards, we breathe out carbon dioxide, and we use up the water, but we get energy. That energy runs our cellular processes. Carbon dioxide is used in photosynthesis to build the mass of a plant. That carbon is transferred to an animal when the animal eats the plant's mass, like a fruit or leaves or roots. When an animal respires, it takes in oxygen and releases carbon dioxide. Photosynthesis and respiration is how most life gets its energy. Respiration is one way to release carbon dioxide back into the air. The other way is through decomposition or burning. As organisms decompose, the carbon in its mass is broken down and released as carbon dioxide. This is called the short carbon cycle. It's what happens year by year, decade by decade. Carbon is taken in and carbon is released back to the atmosphere. But some carbon doesn't get released back into the atmosphere right away. It takes another path. It goes into this long carbon cycle. We just saw carbon is removed from the atmosphere in the short carbon cycle through photosynthesis. It builds into the mass of plants or animals. That's why we're carbon-based life forms. In the long carbon cycle, though, the plants and animals don't decompose. They get buried beneath the sediment and they fossilize. That carbon gets locked away and stored inside rock over very long periods of time, millions of years. This stored carbon becomes what we call fossil fuel. In the natural long carbon cycle, the rocks will slowly erode, releasing teeny tiny amounts of fossil fuel that will then decompose and return carbon to the atmosphere. In the past couple of centuries, though, we've mined fossil fuels and we burn them, basically releasing hundreds of millions of years worth of stored carbon all at once. This is the cause of climate change. Let's talk about greenhouse gases. We mentioned in the nitrogen cycle that nitrogen makes up about 80% of the atmosphere. Oxygen makes up another 20%. So just a tiny fraction of the atmosphere, about 0.1%, are greenhouse gases. Those gases are pretty powerful, allowing energy from the sun into the atmosphere to warm the planet, but limiting the loss of energy that radiates off the planet. The greenhouse gases trap energy and keep the planet warm. Of these greenhouse gases, about half is water. Water is a greenhouse gas. The amount of water in the atmosphere is currently increasing. Why aren't we sounding the alarm about water in the atmosphere and its impact on climate change? There are two reasons why we're not worried about water in the atmosphere. First, the reason water is increasing in the atmosphere is that the temperature is increasing due to an increase in other greenhouse gases. So water isn't the problem, it's an effect. The second reason we're not worried about water is that there's not a lot we can do about it, since about 70% of the planet's surface is covered in water. The next largest percentage of greenhouse gases is carbon dioxide. When this graphic was made, it was about 28% of greenhouse gases. It's now over 40%. The next largest percent of greenhouse gases is methane, which is under 10%. Methane has a more potent impact as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. It traps heat very effectively. However, it's also very short-lived. Methane naturally breaks down within a decade. Carbon dioxide amounts in the atmosphere stay at a higher level for a longer time. In this class, we're going to focus on carbon dioxide. Let's emphasize the composition of the atmosphere with a couple of questions. Here's the first one. If you have 1 million molecules in the atmosphere, how many of them will be nitrogen? Nitrogen makes up 80% of the atmosphere. 80% of 1 million is 800,000. Now, how many carbon dioxide molecules are in 1 million molecules of atmosphere? All greenhouse gases make up 0.1% of the atmosphere. That's about 1,000 molecules. If 40% of those are carbon dioxide, then there will be 400 molecules of carbon dioxide out of 1 million. This is important to understand when we talk about carbon dioxide levels because the units are in parts per million, or ppm. It seems like a very small amount, but these small numbers of greenhouse gases have a huge influence on our climate. Atmospheric carbon dioxide has been measured for a long time, but yearly global records began around the 1950s. These are the parts per million from that time. When I first started teaching this class, this graph didn't have as much data on it. I started keeping track on my own and adding each year's data onto the graph. But 3 years ago, the numbers went off the slide, so I had to find a new graph. Here's that 400 parts per million level. When I was a kid, scientists warned that we were going to pass 350 parts per million. It happened, and the world didn't end. Then when I was in grad school, scientists warned that we were going to pass 375 parts per million. It happened, and the world didn't end. Recently, scientists warned that we were passing 400 parts per million. That happened around 2015. We're still here. Most people misunderstand these warnings. The scientists were not warning about the end of the world. Life on this planet will continue on. It's survived worse. What scientists were warning about was how detrimental and how expensive it will be for our human society. At 350 parts per million, we could have easily reversed climate change with relatively little impact. At 375 parts per million, it would have cost a lot of money, time, and effort to reverse climate change, but it could have been done. At 400 parts per million, we're not reversing it. The question is now, how do we minimize its impact? It's going to be hard, it's going to be expensive, and it's going to take a long time. It's always better to be responsible and prevent problems when they're small than to react after the problems have grown out of hand. Remember this graphic that showed the different percentages of greenhouse gases? Carbon dioxide is listed at 28%. That's the historic percentage prior to about 1800. Since that time, we've burned massive amounts of fossil fuels, all that trapped carbon stored in rocks for hundreds of millions of years. First, we burned fossil fuels for industry, and then levels really took off when we started using cars. That's this purple dot where we are now. If we go back further in time, more than just 1,000 years, this line straight up shows that recent increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. This graph goes back 400,000 years. These data are determined by using tiny bits of trapped atmosphere in Antarctic ice cores. In all that time, the planet hasn't exceeded 300 parts per million until recently. Our species has only been around for half this time. Greenhouse gases keep heat energy in the atmosphere. More greenhouse gases means more heat. Our planet is warming. These are the average global temperatures over the past 100 years. When I first started teaching this class, it was expected that global temperatures would increase 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. I had to change that a few years ago because estimates now say 4 to 6 degrees Celsius, or up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit average. The impact of climate change and a warming planet means that we are losing glaciers. Many communities of people rely upon glaciers for their water supply. Melting glaciers, since glaciers are on land, contribute to sea level rise. For these smaller glaciers, that's negligible, but glaciers or ice sheets sitting on Greenland or Antarctica contain massive amounts of water that, if they melted completely, they would raise sea level over 200 feet. If you live on Greenland, there are some positives. People living there are farming for the first time. Recently, rain was recorded for the first time ever in over 100 years of records at the top of the Greenland ice sheet. There is a difference between glaciers, like that covering Greenland, and sea ice, like the ice in the Arctic Ocean. Sea ice floats in water. It's already displacing water, so it won't raise sea level if it melts. What it will do is allow more warming in the ocean. If there's ice floating on the surface, its light color reflects the sun's rays, keeping the water cooler. If the sea ice melts, though, it exposes the darker ocean, which absorbs the sun's rays and increases temperature in that area. Ocean temperature is important because of ocean currents, also because as water warms, it expands, which contributes to sea level rise. Climate change increases the intensity of weather events like droughts, floods, snow, heat waves, etc. It also increases the spread of disease as vectors like insects move from equatorial regions into more temperate regions. With a changing climate, organisms are displaying massive evolutionary rates of change. We're also seeing massive extinction rates. Any species that does not have the genetic diversity or capability to survive will go extinct. One of the biggest consequences of climate change is agriculture. The USDA has already had to modify the planting zone designations. Agriculture has only existed for 10,000 years in a very stable climate. As weather events intensify, agriculture will become more and more problematic. The consequence of climate change that most people talk about is sea level rise. I think there's also a good argument that agriculture will have the most consequences, but sea level rise will also have major impacts. All these people living along the ocean or major rivers that connect to the ocean will need to move inland. Human movement creates problems. Some people simply don't like immigration, and if resources are scarce, political unrest can occur. Climate change is real. It is serious and severe, but we have survived serious and severe events in the past. We can do so now. It will take everyone pitching in, contributing, behaving responsibly, and being well informed. But it is something we have the capability of doing. Look at the amount of change that has occurred in our society over the past couple of years. We can change. Lastly, I'd like to emphasize that climate change relates mostly to carbon dioxide. There's a little bit related to methane as well. Many people have the misconception that climate change is related to the ozone layer. It is not. That is a separate environmental issue with a different cause. We'll talk about that in our environmental issues lectures, and I know you're looking forward to those.